Midnight in the Mirror World by Fritz Leiber. Originally published in the October 1964 issue of Fantastic Stories of Imagination magazine. Republished in a collection of the author's stories called Night Monsters, which first appeared as an omnibus with his previous book, The Green Millennium, in 1969. An appearance in another magazine came next, in the fall 1970 issue of Strange Fantasy. In 1974, the Night Monsters collection was re-released, this time on its own. 1976 gave us its inclusion in another collection, this one called The Mind Spider and Other Stories. In 1978, it appeared in yet another collection, Heroes and Horrors. Translations of the collections included a German one in 1977, French in 1979, Dutch in 1983, Italian in 1991, and Spanish in 2020. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Midnight in the Mirror World. As the clock downstairs began to clang out midnight's 12 strokes, Giles Neffendor glanced into one of the two big mirrors between which he was passing on his nightly trip, regular as clockwork, from the telescopes on the roof to the pianos and chessboards in the living room. What he saw there made him stop and blink and stare. He was 2 steps above the mid-stair landing, where the great wrought-iron chandelier with its freight of live and dead electric bulbs swung in the chill, fierce gusts of wind coming through the broken, lead-webbed, diamond-paned windows. It swung like a pendulum, a wilder yet more ponderous pendulum than that in the tall clock twanging relentlessly downstairs. He stayed aware of its menace as he peered in the mirror. Since there was a second mirror behind him, what he saw in the one he faced was not a single reflection of himself, but many, each smaller and dimmer than the one in front of it, a half-spread stack of reflections going off toward infinity. Each reflection, except the 8th, showed against a background of mirror gloom only his dark, lean, aquiline face, or at least the edge of it, from bucket size down to dime size, peering back at him intently from under its sleek crown of black, silver-shot hair. But in the 8th reflection his hair was wildly disordered, and his face was leaden green, gape-jawed and bulging-eyed with horror. Also, his 8th reflection was not alone. Beside it was a thin black figure from which a ribbony black arm reached out and lay on his reflected shoulder. He could see only the edge of the black figure. Most of it was hidden by the reflected gilt mirror frame, but he was sure it was thin. The look of horror on his face in that reflection was so intense and so suggestive of strangulation that he clutched at his throat with both hands. All his reflections, from the nearly life-size giants to the Lilliputians, copied this sudden gesture, except the 8th. The 11th stroke of midnight resounded brassily. An especially fierce gust of wind blew the chandelier closer to him, so that one of its black, hook-fingered arms approached his shoulder, and he cringed away from it before he recognized it for the familiar object it was. It should have been hung higher. He was such a tall man, and he should have had the window repaired, but his head missed the chandelier, except when the wind blew hard, and after he'd been unable to find a craftsman who could work leaded glass. He had not bothered about either chore. The 12th stroke clanged. When he looked into the mirror the next instant, all strangeness was gone. His 8th reflection was like the rest. All his reflections were alike, even the dimmest, most distant ones that melted into mirror smoke, and there was no sign of a black figure in any one of them, although he peered until his vision blurred. He continued downstairs, choosing a moment when the chandelier was swinging away from him. He went immediately to his Steinway and played Scriabin preludes and sonatas until dawn, fighting the wind with them until it slunk away, then analyzed chess positions in the latest Russian tournament until the oppressive daylight had wearied him enough for sleep. From time to time, he thought about what he had glimpsed in the mirror, and each time it seemed to him more likely that the disordered eighth reflection had been an optical illusion. His eyes had been strained and weary with stargazing when it had happened. There had been those rushing shadows from the swinging chandelier, or even his narrow black necktie blown by the wind, while the thin black figure might have been simply a partial second reflection of his own black clothes. Imperfections in the mirror could explain why these things had stood out only in the eighth reflection. For that matter, the odd appearance of his face in that reflection might have been due to no more than a tarnished spot in the mirror's silvering. Like this whole vast house, and himself, the mirror was decaying. He awoke when the first stars, winking on in the sky of deepening blue, signaled his personal dawn. He had almost forgotten the incident of the mirror by the time he went upstairs, donned stadium boots and a hooded long sheepskin coat in the cupola room, and went out on the widow's walk to uncap his telescopes and take up his stargazing. He made, as he realized, a quite medieval figure, except that the intruders in his heavens were not comets, mostly, but Earth satellites moving at their characteristic crawl of 20-some minutes from zenith to horizon. He resolved a difficult double in Canis Major and was almost certain he saw a pale gas front advancing across the blackness of the Horsehead Nebula. Finally, he capped and shrouded his instruments and went inside. Habit started him downstairs and put him between the mirrors above the landing at the same minute and second of the day as he had arrived at that spot last night. There was no wind, and the black chandelier with its asymmetric constellation of bulbs hung motionless on its black chain. No reeling shadows tonight. Otherwise, everything was exactly the same. And while the clock struck 12, he saw in the mirror exactly what he had seen last night. Tiny, pale, horror-struck Neffendor face, black ribbon arm touching its shoulder or neck, as if arresting him or summoning him to some doom. Tonight, perhaps, a little more of the black figure showed, as if it peered with one indistinguishable eye around the tinied gold frame. Only this time, it was not the eighth reflection that showed these abnormalities, but the seventh. And this time, when the glassy aberration vanished with the 12th brassy stroke, he found it less easy to keep his thoughts from dwelling obsessively on the event. He also found himself groping for an explanation in terms of an hallucination rather than an optical illusion that came so pat 2 nights running was hardly credible, and yet an hallucination that confined itself to only one in a stack of reflections was also most odd. Most of all, the elusive malignity of the thin black figure struck him much more forcibly than it had the previous night. An hallucination, or ghost, or demon, that met you face to face was one thing. You could strike out at it, hysterically claw at it, try to drive your fist through it. But a black ghost that lurked in a mirror, and not only that, but in the deepest depths of a mirror, behind many panes of thick glass. Somehow the reflected panes seemed as real as the actual ones, working its evil will on your powerless, shrunken image there. That implied a craftiness and caution and horrid calculation which fitted very well with the figure's cat-and-mousing advance from the 8th reflection to the 7th. The implication was that here was a being who hated Giles Neffendor with demonic intensity. This night and morning, he avoided the eerie Scriabin, while the chess games he analyzed were frolicsome, attacking ones by Andresen, Kieseritzky, and the youthful Steinitz. He had decided to wait another 24 hours, and then, if the figure appeared a third time, systematically analyze the matter and decide on what steps to take. Yet, meanwhile, he could not wholly keep himself from searching his memory for people whom he had injured to the degree that they would bear him a bitter and enduring hatred. But although he searched quite conscientiously, by snatches, through the 5.5 decades over which his memory stretched, he found no very likely candidates for the position of arch-hater or hater to the death of Giles Neffendor. He was a gentle person, and, cushioned by inherited wealth, had never had to commit a murder or steal a large sum of money. He had wived, begat, divorced, or rather been divorced. His wife had remarried profitably, his children were successful in far places. He had enough money to maintain his long body and his tall house, while both mouldered, and to indulge his mild passions for the most ethereal of the arts, the most coolly aloof of the sciences, and the most darkly profound of the games. Professional rivals? He no longer played in chess tournaments, confining his activities in that direction to a few correspondence games. He gave no more piano recitals, while his contributions to astronomical journals were of the fewest and involved no disputes. Women? At the time of his divorce, he had hoped it would free him to find new relationships, but his lonely habits had proved too comfortable and strong, and he had never taken up the search. Perhaps in his vanity he had dreaded failure, or merely the effort. At this point he became aware of a memory buried in his mind, like a dark seed, but it refused to come clear. Something about chess? No. Really, he had done nothing much to anyone, for good or ill, he decided. Why should anyone hate him for doing nothing? Hate him enough to chase his image through mirrors? He asked himself fruitlessly as he watched Kieseritzky's Black Queen implacably pursue Andersen's White King. The next night, he carefully timed his descent of the stairs, using his precision clocks in the cupola, with the result that, precision machinery proving less reliable than habit, the downstairs clock had already struck 5 strokes when he thrust himself breathlessly between the mirrors above the landing. But his greenish, horror-struck face was there, in the 6th reflection this time, as he'd fatalistically assumed it would be, and the slender black figure was there too, with outstretched arm. This time he seemed to detect that it was wearing a veil or stocking mask. He could distinguish none of its features, but there was a faint shimmering in the face area, rather like the pale gas front he had once again detected crossing the Horsehead Nebula. This night he completely altered his routine, neither opening a piano nor setting out any of the chessmen. Instead, he lay for an hour with eyes shut, to rest them, and then spent the rest of the night and morning investigating reflections of reflections in the mirrors on the stairs and in 2 somewhat smaller ones which he set up in the living room and tilted by the fractional inch to get the best effects. By the end of that time he had made a number of interesting discoveries. He'd noted reflections of reflections before, especially on the stairs, and been amused by their oddity, but he'd never thought about them systematically, and certainly never experimented with them. They turned out to be a fascinating little field of study. Vest pocket optics, a science in miniature. Vest pocket wasn't such a bad designation, because you had to stick your vest and yourself between the 2 mirrors in order to observe the phenomena. Though, come to think of it, you ought to be able to do the same thing with a periscope held sideways. By that means introducing your vision between the mirrors without introducing yourself. It might be worth trying. But getting back to basics, when you stood between nearly parallel mirrors, looking at one, you saw first the direct reflection of your face, next the reflection of the back of your head in the mirror behind you. Then, barely visible around those two, you saw the second reflection of your face, really just an edge of hair and cheek and hair. Then the second reflection of the back of your head, and so on. As the heads grew smaller, you saw more of each until the entire face became visible, quite tiny and dim. This meant, for one thing, that the eighth reflection he'd seen the first midnight had really been the 15th, since he'd only counted reflections of his face, as far as he could remember, and between every two of those, there was a reflection of the back of his head. Oh, this mirror world, he decided, was fascinating. Or worlds, rather, a series of shells around him, like the crystal globes of Ptolemaic astronomy in which the stars and planets were set, going out, in theory, to infinity, and in each shell himself staring at himself in the next shell. The way the heads got tinier intrigued him. He measured the distance between the two mirrors on the stairs, 8 feet almost to the inch, and calculated that the eighth reflection of his face was therefore 116 feet away, as if it were peering back at him from a little attic window down the street. He was almost tempted to go to the roof and scan with his binoculars for such windows. But since it was himself he was seeing, the eighth reflection was size-wise 232 feet away. He would have to scan for dwarves. Most interesting. It was delightful to think of all the different things his reflections could be doing, if each had the power to move around independently in the thin world of its crystal shell. Why, with all those shell selves industriously occupied, Giles Neffendor could well become the world's most accomplished pianist, most knowledgeable field astronomer, and highest ranking of all chess grandmasters. The thought almost revived his dead ambitions. Hadn't Lasker won the 1924 New York International Tournament at 56, while the charm of the speculation made him quite forget the menace of the black figure he'd now glimpsed 3 times? Returning to reality somewhat reluctantly, he set himself to determine how many of his reflections he could see in practice rather than theory. He discovered that even with the best illumination, replacing all the dead bulbs in the wrought iron chandelier, he could recognize at most only the 9th or perhaps the 10th reflection of his face. After that, his visage became a tiny, indistinguishable ash-gray blank in the glass. In reaching this conclusion, he also found that it was very difficult to count the reflections accurately. One or more would tend to get lost, or he'd lose count somewhere along the line. It was easiest to count the gilt mirror frames, since these stood in a close-packed row, like golden numeral ones, even though, for the 10th reflection of his face, say, this involved counting 19 gilt ones, 10 belonging to the mirror in front of him and 9 to the mirror behind. He wondered how he could have been so sure the first midnight that it was his 8th reflection which had shown the unpleasant alterations, and the 7th and 6th reflections on the 2 subsequent midnights. He decided that his shocked mind must have made a stabbing guess, and that it very likely had been inaccurate, despite the instant uncertainty he'd felt. Next night, he'd watch more carefully, and the 5th reflection would be easier to count. He also discovered that although he could at most count 10 reflections of his face, he could distinguish 13 and perhaps 14 reflections of a bright point of light, a pencil flashlight or even a candle flame held close to his cheek. Those tinied candle flames looked strangely like stars do in a cheap telescope. Odd. He was eager to count more reflections than that, to break his record, as it were, and he even fetched his best pair of binoculars and stared into the mirror with them, using for light point an inch of brightly flaming candle affixed to the top of the right-hand binocular tube. But as he'd feared, this was no help at all, magnification fading out the more distant light points to nothing, like using too powerful an eyepiece on a small telescope. He thought of making and testing out a periscope candle attachment, but that seemed a touch over-elaborate, and in any case it was high time he got to bed, almost noon. He felt in remarkably good spirits. For the first time in years he had discovered a new thing in which to be interested. Reflectology mightn't be quite up to astronomy, musicology, or chess, but it was an elegant little science all the same. And the mirror world was fascinating. He looked forward excitedly to what he'd next see in it, if only the phenomena didn't stop. It was perhaps his eagerness which got him between the stairway mirrors next night, several seconds before the clock began to strike 12. His early arrival, however, didn't inhibit the phenomena, as he suddenly feared might happen. They began on the clock's first twanging stroke, and whatever may have happened on previous evenings, it was certainly the fifth reflection which was altered tonight. The figures were only about 70 feet away now, as he'd earlier calculated, and so considerably larger. His fifth reflected face was pale as ever, yet he fancied its expression was changing, but because it had gone more than halfway into eclipse behind the massed heads in front of it, he couldn't be sure. And the black figure definitely was wearing a veil, although he still couldn't make out the features behind it. Yes, a veil, and long black gloves, one of which sleekly cased the slender arm outstretched to his shoulder, for he suddenly realized that despite its height almost equal to his own, the figure was feminine. A gust of fear, hard to understand, went through him at that discovery. As on the second night, he wanted to strike out at the figure to prove its insubstantiality, smash the glass. But could that affect a figure 70 feet away? Would smashing the single glass in front of him smash all the 9 panes he calculated still separated him from the figures in the mirror world? Perhaps it would, and then the black figure in the mirror world could come straight out at him. Now. In any case, the veiled figure, if she continued her approach, would be with him in 5 more nights. Perhaps smashing the glass now would simply end the horrifying, fascinating phenomena, foil the figure for good. But did he want to do that? As he asked himself that last question, the 12th stroke came, and the black lady in the 5th reflection vanished. The rest of the night, while he played Tchaikovsky and studied the chess games of Vera Menchik, Lisa Lane, and Mrs. Piatigorsky, searching for hidden depths in them, he reviewed the lives and loves of Giles Neffendor. He discovered that the women in his life had been few, and those with whom he had become seriously entangled, or to whom he had done possible injury, fewer still. The half-dozen candidates were all, so far as he knew, happily married and or otherwise successful. This, of course, included his divorced wife, although she had often complained of him and his hobbies. On the whole, though romanticizing women, he had tended to run away from them, he concluded wryly. Perhaps the dark lady was a generalized woman, emblematic of the entire sex, come to be revenged on him for his faint-heartedness. His smile grew wryer. Perhaps her funeral costume was anticipatorily for him. He thought, oh, the human infatuation with guilt and retribution, the dread of, and perhaps the desire for, punishment. How ready we are to think others hate us. During this search of his memory, the dark seed stirred several times. He seemed to be forgetting some one woman, But the seed refused to come clear of its burial until the clock struck its 12th stroke next midnight, when, just as the now clearly feminine figure in the fourth reflection vanished, he spoke the name Nina Fazenera. That brought the buried incident, or rather all of it but one crucial part, back to him at once. It came back with that tigerish rush with which memory, lost small incidents and encounters will, one moment non-existent, the next recalled with almost dizzying suddenness. It had happened all of 10 years ago, 6 years at least before his divorce, and he had only once met Miss Fazenera, a tall, slender woman with black hair, bold, hawk-like features, slightly protuberant eyes, and rather narrow, long, mobile lips, which the slim tip of her tongue was forever wetting. Her voice had been husky yet rapid, and she had moved with a nervous, pantherine grace, so that her heavy silk dress had hissed on her gaunt yet challenging figure. Nina Fazenera had come to him here at this house on the pretext of asking his advice about starting a school of piano in a distant suburb across the city. She was an actress, too, she had told him, but he had gathered she had not worked much in recent years, just as he had soon been guessing that her age was not much less than his own, the jet of her hair a dye, the taut smoothness of her facial skin astringents and an ivory foundation makeup, her youthful energy a product of willpower. In short, that she was something of a fake. Her knowledge of piano rudimentary, her acting a couple of seasons of summer stock, and a few bit parts on Broadway. But a brave and gallant fake nonetheless. Quite soon she had made it clear that she was somewhat more interested in himself than in his advice, and that she was ready, alert, on guard, dangerous, yet responsive, for any encounter with him, whether at a luncheon date a week in the future or here and now, on the instant. It had been, he recalled, as if a duelist had lightly yet briskly brushed his cheek and lips with a thin leather glove. And yes, she had been wearing gloves, he remembered now, of a sudden, dark green ones edged with yellow, the same colors as her heavy silken dress. He had been mightily attracted to her. Strange how he had forgotten that taut, nervous hour. But he had just become re-reconciled with his wife for perhaps the dozenth time, and there was about Nina Fazenera an avidity and a recklessness, and especially an almost psychotic-seeming desperation, which had frightened him, or at least put him very much on guard. He recalled wondering if she took drugs. So he had courteously, yet most coolly, and with infinite stubbornness, refused all her challenges, which in the end had grown quite mocking, and he had shown her to the door and closed it on her. And then the next day he had read in the paper of her suicide. That was why he had forgotten the incident, he decided now. He had felt sharply guilty about it. Not that he thought that he possessed any fatal glamour so that a woman would die at his rebuff, but that he conceivably had represented Nina Fazenera's last cast of the dice with destiny, and he, not consciously knowing what was at stake, had coldly told her, "You lose." But there was something else he was forgetting, something about her death, which his mind had suppressed even more tightly. He was certain of that. Glancing about uneasily, he stepped down onto the landing beneath the low-dipping chandelier and hurried down the rest of the stairs. He had just recalled that he had torn out the story of her death from a cheap tabloid, and now he spent the rest of the night hunting for it among his haphazardly filed papers. Toward dawn he discovered it, a ragged-edged Browning thing tucked inside one of his additional copies of the Chopin Nocturnes. Former Broadway actress dresses for own funeral. Last night, the glamorous Nina Fasanera, who was playing on Broadway as recently as 3 years ago, committed suicide by hanging, according to Police Lieutenant Ben Davidow, in the room she rented at 1738 Waverly Place, Edgemont. A purse with 87 cents in it lay on top of her dresser. She left no note or diary, however, though police are still searching. Despondency was the probable cause of Miss Fasanera's act, according to her landlady, Elvira Winters, who discovered the body at 3 a.m.
"She was a charming tenant, always the lady and very beautiful," Mrs. Winters said. "But lately she'd seemed restless and unhappy. I'd let her get 5 weeks behind on her rent. Now who'll pay it?"
Before taking her life, the 39-year-old Miss Fasanera had dressed herself in a black silk cocktail gown with black accessories, including a veil and long gloves. She had also pulled down the shades and turned on all the lights in the room. It was the glare of these lights through the transom which caused Mrs. Winters to enter the actress's small, high-ceilinged room by a duplicate key when there was no answer to her knocking. There she saw Miss Fasanera's body hanging by a short length of clothesline from the ceiling light fixture. A chair lay overturned nearby. In its plastic seat cover, Lieutenant Davidow later found impressions which matched the actress's spike heels. Dr. Leonard Bellstrom estimated she had been dead for 4 hours when he examined the body at 4 a.m. Mrs. Winters said,
"She was hanging between the tall mirror on the closet door and the wide one on her dresser. She could almost have reached out and kicked them if she could have kicked. I could see her in both of them, over and over, when I tried to lift her up, before I felt how cold she was. And then all those bright lights, it was horrible, like the theater."
When Giles Neffendorf finished reading the clipping, he nodded twice and stood frowning. Then he got out maps of the city and suburbs and measured the straight-line distance from the rooming house in Edgemont to his own place across the city, then used the scales on the maps to convert his measurements to miles. 11.5 it came out, as nearly as the limits of accuracy would make it. Then he calculated the time that had elapsed since Nina Fasanera's death. 10 years and 101 days. From Mrs. Winters' statement, the distance between the mirrors between which she'd hanged herself had been about 8 feet, the same distance as between the mirrors on his stairs. If she'd entered the mirror world when she died and been advancing toward this house as she'd moved, the last 5 nights, 2 reflections or 16 feet each time, then in 10 years and 101 days, she'd have traveled 60,058 feet. That figured out to 11 miles and 1,978 feet. 11.5 miles, or close to it. He puzzled, almost idly, as to why a person could travel only such a short distance in the mirror world each 24 hours. It must depend on the distance between the 2 mirrors of your departure, and also on the 2 mirrors of your arrival. Perhaps you traveled 1 reflection for each day and 1 for each night. Perhaps his theory of shells, like the Ptolemaic ones, was true, and in any shell there was only 1 door, and you had to search to find it, as if you were traversing a maze. To find the right 2 doors in the crystal maze in 24 hours could be a most difficult task. And there must be all sorts of interlocking dimensions in the mirror world, slow paths and fast ones. If you traveled between mirrors set on different stars, you might travel faster than light. He wondered, again almost idly, why he had been chosen for this visitation, and why of all women it should have been Nina Fasanera, who had had the strength and the will to thread purposefully the glassy labyrinth for 10 years. He was not so much frightened as awed that an hour's meeting should lead to all these consequences. Could undying love grow in an hour? Or was it undying hate that had flowered? Had Nina Fasanera known about the mirror world when she'd hanged herself? He recalled now that one of the things she'd said lightly when she'd tried to storm his interest had been that she was a witch, and she would have known about the mirrors on his stairs matching those in her room. She'd seen them. Next midnight, when he saw the black figure in the third reflection, he instantly recognized Nina's pale, gauntly, lovely face behind the veil, and wondered why he had not recognized it at least 4 nights before. Rather anxiously, he glanced down toward her black stockinged ankles, which were slender and unswollen, then quickly back to her face again. She was gazing at him gravely, perhaps with the ghost of a smile. By now, his own reflection was almost wholly eclipsed behind the ones in front of it. He could not even guess at his expression, nor did he want to. He had eyes only for Nina Fasanera. The impact of his years of unfelt loneliness shook him. He realized how desperately he had been wishing someone would search him out. The clock twanged on, swiftly marking time forever gone. Now he knew that he loved Nina Fasanera, had loved her since the one only hour they'd met. That was why he'd never stirred from this rotting house, why he'd prepared his mind for the mirror world with chess squares and singing wires and the stars. Since the hour they'd met, except for color and the veil, her costume was the same she'd worn that fateful 60 minutes. If she'd only move, he thought, he'd faintly hear the hiss of the heavy silk through the 5 thick panes of glass remaining. If she'd only make that smile more certain. The 12th stroke twanged. This time he felt a terrible pang of loss as her figure vanished, but it was swiftly replaced with a feeling of surety and faith. For the next 3 of his nocturnal days, Giles Neffendor was happy and light-hearted. He played the piano music he loved best: Beethoven, Mozart, Chopin, Scriabin, Domenico Scarlatti. He played over the classic chess games of Nimzowitsch, Alekhine, Capablanca, Emanuel Lasker, and Steinitz. He lovingly scanned his favorite celestial objects: the beehive in Cancer, the Pleiades and Hyades, the great nebula in Orion's sword. He noticed new telescopic constellations and thought he saw the faintest crystal paths. Occasionally his thoughts strayed eagerly yet guiltily, as if to forbidden fruit, to the mazy crystal corridors of the mirror world, that secret diamond universe, and to his 1,000 wonderings about it. Endless rooms and halls, ceilinged and floored by transparency, and all the curious, mirror-lost folk who lived adrift in them, piercingly sweet music, games of glass, revels and routs at 1,000 levels, the tinkling of 1,000,000 glittering chandeliers, diamond pathways to the farthest stars. But he would always check these thoughts. There would be time enough for them, he felt certain. Experienced reality is always more satisfactory than imagination and illusion. And often he would think of Nina and of the strangeness of their relationship. 2 atoms marked by one encounter and now drawn together among all the trillions of like atoms in the universe. Did it take 10 years for love to grow, or only 10 seconds? Both. But he checked these thoughts too, and struck the keys, or moved the men, or refocused the scope. There were moments of doubt and fear. Nina might be the incarnation of hate, the jet-black spider in the crystal web. Certainly she was the unknown, though he felt he knew her so well. There had been those early intimations of psychosis, of a pantherine restlessness, and there had been that first glimpse of his face, sick with horror, but they were moments only. Before each of the 3 remaining midnights he dressed with unusual care, the black suit newly brushed, the white shirt fresh, the narrow black necktie carefully knotted. It pleased him to think that he had not had to change the color of his suit to match that of her dress. The first of the 3 midnights he was almost certain of her smile. The next midnight he was sure of it. Now both figures were in the first reflection, and he could see his own face again, scarce 4 feet away. He, too, was smiling gravely. The horror was gone. Nina's black-gloved hand resting on his shoulder, the black fingertips touching his white collar, now seemed a lover's gesture. The night after that, the wind came back at last, blowing with more and more violence, although there were no clouds, so that the stars flickered and streamed impossibly in his scopes. The gale seemed to fasten on and shake their beams like crystal stalks. The sky was granular with wind. He could not remember such a blow. By 11, it had almost driven him from the roof, but he stuck it out, although the wind increased in frenzy. Instead of daunting, it filled him with a terrific excitement. He felt he could leap into the air and be blown light-swift anywhere he willed in the diamond-dazzling cosmos, except that he had another rendezvous. When he finally went inside, shaking with the cold, and took off his fleece-lined coat, he became aware of a rhythmic crunching and crashing below, with rather long intervals between. When he went down the stairs, they were dark, and the crashes were louder. He realized that the great chandelier above the landing must be swinging so far that it was hitting the lead-webbed windows beyond, breaking their remaining panes, and had long since burst all the electric globes it carried. He felt his way down by the wall, keeping close to it to avoid the chandelier's murderous swings. His fingers touched absolute smoothness. Glass. Then the glass rippled for an instant, tingling his fingers, and he heard husky, irregular breathing and the hissing of heavy silk. Then slender arms were around him, and a woman's slim body was pressed against his, and hungry lips met his lips, first through a faintly astringent, dryish, tormenting, tantalizing veil, then flesh to flesh. He could feel under his hands the ribbed smoothness of heavy silk and of pliant, lightly fleshed ribs under that. All in utter darkness and pandemonium. Almost drowned in the latter, midnight's last strokes were twanging. A hand moved up his back, and suede-cased fingers lightly brushed his neck. As the last stroke twanged, one of the fingers turned hard and stiff and cruel and dug under his collar so that it caught him like a hook by the collar and the tightly knitted tie the collar covered. It wrenched him into the air. A terrible pain stabbed at the base of his skull, then filled it to bursting. It was 4 days before the policeman who nightly patrolled beyond the gate discovered by a stab of his flashlight the body of Giles Neffendor, whom he knew by sight, though never a sight like this, hanging from the wrought-iron chandelier above the landing strewn with glassy shards. It might have been longer than 4 days, except that a chess player across the city, contesting a correspondence game with the well-known recluse, spurred the police into action when the move on his last postcard had gone 10 days unanswered. His first queries were ignored, but an evening phone call got action. The policeman reported back the unpleasant condition of the body, the black, hooked, wrought-iron chandelier finger thrust under the noose of collar and tie, and the glass shards, and several other matters. He never did report what he saw in one of the 2 mirrors on the stairs when he looked at it closely, his powerful flash beside his chest as his wristwatch signaled midnight. There was a stack of reflections of his own shocked, sharply shadowed face, but in the 4th reflection there were momentarily 2 figures, hand in hand, looking back toward him over their shoulders and smiling impishly at him, he thought. The one figure was that of Giles Neffendor, though looking more youthful than he recalled seeing him in recent years. The other was that of a lady in black, the upper half of her face veiled.